I've always had a thing for the strange and the mysterious. Even as a kid growing up in Salem, Massachusetts, I was drawn to the bizarre and the unexplained. It was like a part of me that just had to be satisfied, like an itch that wouldn't go away. But it wasn't until I moved to the city and started working as a radio host that my fascination took on a whole new dimension. I hosted a weekend show called Strangetown Saturdays, and it was a hit. I received countless calls from people who wanted to share their unexplained experiences. They told me about everything from out-of-body experiences to sightings of Sasquatch helping himself to a camper's picnic, and even encounters with aliens. It was fascinating to hear these stories and to see how much the listeners connected with the show. But it got stranger when an unknown caller started ringing me, always at 11 o'clock. Initially, I took these calls privately, playing tunes for the listeners, while quietly listening to the caller. After a week, the caller phoned the station, and the listeners could hear them too. I began receiving emails warning me that this caller was strange, and I should be careful. "Can you hear me, my dear?" the voice on the other end asked. It was deep, with an undertone of something almost metallic, as if it were coming from a different plane of existence. I hesitated for a moment, not sure if I should answer. After all, the caller had just acknowledged that they had been calling me privately for a week. Why now all of a sudden did they want to talk on the air? "I'm sorry, who is this?" I finally replied, trying to maintain my professional demeanor. "And why have you been calling me?" The voice chuckled, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. "I am known by many names," it said cryptically, "but you may call me the Watcher. As for why I have been calling you, my dear, I have been watching you for quite some time. I find you fascinating, and I wanted to see if you would be willing to engage with me on air." What did they mean by watching me? And why did they want to talk to me on the air? It all seemed so surreal. "I'm sorry, I don't understand," I stammered, trying to regain my composure. "What do you want from me?" The Watcher chuckled again. "All in due time, my dear. All in due time. But for now, let's just say that I have a proposition for you, something that could change your life forever." I played a random song, trying to lighten the mood a bit while calming the pounding in my chest. Then, I went through to the other room to ask George, the radio admin guy, if he had the Watcher's number. Unfortunately, he told me that we didn't have it because the caller had withheld their number. I had dealt with other pranks before, such as, "Do you know Ferris?" or "Is it true you're sick with ligma?" But nothing on this level. George struggled to block the Watcher's calls, but the night passed without any further attempts. I interacted with a few more listeners and played more songs according to their requests. For a while, I managed to distract myself from that disturbing event. I bid the remaining listeners farewell as the first rays of sunlight appeared on the distant horizon. The station manager, Margaret, who had hired me because she saw something in me that she liked, entered the studio. "Great job on the show, Jimmy," she praised. "We've seen a significant increase in listeners since you started Strangetown Saturdays." I smiled and expressed my gratitude. "It certainly doesn't hurt that this town is full of strange tales," I quipped. Margaret then brought up the Watcher. "Don't let the odd caller discourage you, Jimmy," she encouraged. "I'll see you tonight. Now, get home to the sunny side of town and get some rest. You've earned it." Returning to my apartment, I opened the door only to feel my foot brushing against something, a dry, crinkly sound. I peered down to discover a small letter, my name inscribed on it. As I unfolded the paper, my heart quickened, my mind racing. In bold letters, the message was clear. "Do not attempt to block my calls." I phoned Margaret, my voice trembling, and told her about the note the Watcher had left at my apartment. "Margaret, I'm really scared. What should I do?" "Jimmy, come back to the radio station," she replied firmly. "You'll be safe here." I was feeling a mix of fear and confusion. Who the hell is behind this? How did they know where I live? Margaret's voice was steady. "The town's small, Jimmy. It's not impossible for someone to figure it out. But let's focus on keeping you safe." Once the call ended, I decided to reach out to April, my coworker and friend. "Hey, April. Sorry to bother you, but something strange happened last night." She listened quietly as I recounted the events from the previous night and spoke of the note I had just found. "Margaret wants me to head back to the station. Thinks I'll be more safe there than at my apartment, but I can't shake the feeling that someone's been watching me. April said thoughtfully after I finished. That's concerning. Maybe you should go back to the station like Margaret suggests. It's better to be safe than sorry. Once back at the radio station, George and Margaret were there waiting for me. Jimmy, we're concerned about these calls, George said, his brow furrowed. They're escalating, and we can't just ignore them. Margaret chimed in. If this continues, we'll need to discuss involving the police, although we both believe it's a prank. I managed to get some rest in the back room, on a mattress on the floor, but the sleep was uneasy. Could the watcher see me right now? Did they know I had left my apartment? My mind was racing, and I couldn't shake off the feeling of unease. I didn't want my parents worrying about me, so I asked April if I could crash on her couch, and she agreed. It was a bit awkward because our feelings for each other were growing, but I had made it clear to her before all this that I wasn't ready for a relationship and didn't want a girlfriend. At that particular time in my life, I was too absorbed in my career to care about that stuff. The following Saturday came, and my first caller was one I wished I never had. It was the watcher. Hello, Jimmy. You didn't respond to me last time. I had a proposition for you, one that could change your life forever. The voice echoed through the receiver. I quickly put the watcher on mute after the message went out on air and played a song for the listeners. As the melody filled the studio, I took a deep breath before responding to the watcher. Yeah, that's because I'm not interested, I said, my tone firm. I don't care what you have to offer to make my life better. I don't need that. The song finished, and George, who had been listening in, entered the studio. He walked over to the control panel and quickly disconnected the call from the watcher, ensuring no more messages from the mysterious caller would be heard on air. Thanks, George, I said, relieved that the situation was under control for the moment. No problem, Jimmy, he replied. We'll keep an eye on things and let Margaret know about this latest development, and preferably, don't even answer restricted calls. Even if you're on your own. Okay, Jimmy? There was another call coming through, and I pressed the button for it to be broadcast. My heart skipped a beat as I heard the familiar voice on the line. It was the watcher. They had managed to call back despite being disconnected. Can you play Bad Things by Wednesday 13? The voice asked. That song. It wasn't part of our usual playlist. It was strange that someone wanted it to be played. That's an interesting choice, I replied, trying to sound composed. I want bad things to happen to you, Jimmy, the watcher said ominously, and the caller hung up. As the show came to an end, George and I made our way out of the studio. He could see the strain on my face, and without a word, he offered to drive me back to April's place. Thanks, George, I said, gratefully accepting the ride. I'll call you in the morning. As we arrived at April's place, she was already in the living room when we entered. At least there was someone familiar to greet me after such a weird day. She tried to avoid the topic of the watcher, but eventually, she couldn't hold back any longer. I heard the whole show, she said softly, her eyes filled with concern. I'm worried for you, Jimmy. I sank into the couch beside her, feeling the weight of the day finally catching up to me. I don't know what to do, April, I admitted. I've never experienced anything like this before. Sure, I'm used to regular pranks, but not this. April looked at me thoughtfully. Do you think this could be someone you've upset in the past, or maybe recently? I was taken aback by her question. I don't know, April, I replied, feeling a bit defensive. I try to get along with everyone. Why do you ask? April frowned slightly. I'm just trying to understand why someone would go to such lengths to mess with you like this. I shook my head, feeling a mix of frustration and confusion. I honestly have no idea, but I need to figure this out and put an end to it before it escalates further. The night went by like normal, but the thought of the caller was constantly present. Was the watcher watching me? The next day, I approached Margaret with a request. Margaret, I've been dealing with some personal issues lately and I need some time off. I'd still like to continue my show, but could we pre-record some podcasts so it seems like I'm still on air? Margaret looked at me sympathetically. Of course, Jimmy. Take all the time you need. We'll make it work. Grateful for her understanding, I spent the rest of the day recording and editing the podcasts. Everything seemed to be going smoothly until one morning when there was a knock at April's apartment door. I opened it to find a small package on the doorstep. On the lid was a chilling message. "Why aren't you coming into work anymore?" My heart sank as I read the words. How did the watcher know where I lived? Was this a warning or a threat? Inside the box was a tape. I decided to play it on my cassette player, hoping for some answers. As I listened, my blood ran cold. It was the watcher's voice, and the message was horrifying. "I know where you live, Jimmy. I've been watching you. I can make bad things happen, very bad things." I felt a chill run down my spine. This was getting out of hand. I quickly threw the tape in the trash, my heart pounding in my chest. It was all becoming too much, and I didn't want to involve anyone else in this mess. As I walked back to my apartment, the weight of the situation began to settle on me. How did the watcher know where I lived? And what did they mean by bad things? After checking on things and retrieving my mail, everything seemed normal, but the unsettling feeling from the tape was still fresh in my mind. I then headed back to April's place. She had made dinner, and we settled down to watch TV together. As the night went on, April cuddled into me, and without thinking, I leaned down and kissed her. So much for not wanting to be with her, I thought ruefully. I just blamed it on the situation, telling myself that it was the stress of everything going on. In my usual routine, I'd be at my own place and we'd just text back and forth. I was grateful for her letting me stay, but I sort of felt that I should protect her. There was a knock at the door, which was strange. I looked at the clock. It was 1 minute past 11. I moved a sleeping April to the other side of the couch and looked out the window at the front door. Nothing. Nobody. Just the streetlights, and a cat running across the road with a mouse in its mouth. But then I noticed something small jammed in the letterbox. I pulled it out, a small package. Inside was another cassette tape. I looked at the tape on the floor in front of me, this time displaying the letter D. I picked it up, curious and confused, giving it a thorough examination. It looked identical to the other one, except for the letter. Surely they came from the same place, and considering the audio from the last one, I wasn't at all inclined to listen to this one. I threw it in the trash and went to bed. The watcher kept sending more tapes, each one more disturbing than the last. They all contained messages and threats directed at me, and some even had eerie noises. It felt like the watcher was always there, just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. One day, April came to me and said she knew about the tapes. She had seen them in the trash and had listened to some of them. She was scared, just like I was, and she suggested that we go to the police. I was hesitant at first, but I knew she was right. I couldn't keep living like this, always looking over my shoulder, always on edge. We went to the police together, and I told them everything. They took the tapes as evidence and promised to do everything they could to catch the watcher. For the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this nightmare would finally come to an end. But little did I know, things were about to get even worse. As the police investigated, they found something disturbing. The recordings of the Strangetown Saturdays where the watcher had called and threatened me on air were missing. It was as if the watcher had anticipated my actions and planned accordingly. At first, I couldn't understand how the recordings could be missing. Our radio station had top-notch security, and the archives were supposed to be kept under lock and key. But then, it hit me. How could the recordings be missing unless the watcher was closer than I thought? They had to have had access to the station, someone on the inside helping them. It took me a while to put the pieces together. But eventually, the pieces started to fit. While I was back on the air, I had another strange call from the watcher, but this time there was interference, as if the call was being made close by. I realized then that the watcher had to be someone I knew, someone who was in close proximity to the radio station. I was at the radio station, in the middle of broadcasting my show when the power went out. I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming towards me. I was frozen in fear, not knowing what to do. I heard the familiar voice of the watcher. "Hello, Jimmy. It's time to play a little game," they said, their voice dripping with malice. I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped, like a mouse in a cage. The watcher had me right where they wanted me, and I didn't know how to escape. I felt like I was losing my mind. Eventually, the power came back on, but the watcher was nowhere to be found. I expected to see George in the other room and ask him what happened to the power, but he wasn't there. Then I saw George running to his car. That's when the penny dropped. It was George who was behind all of this. George was too fast to catch up to and drove away. I informed the police, but this time they didn't do anything as there was no proof of George being involved. Then, I received a call from April in a distressed state. She said George had her locked in a bedroom in her apartment and she needed help. I called the police and met them there. The police forced themselves inside and freed April. They went through the apartment and the bathroom door was locked. They forced themselves in and found George dead, hanging from the shower railing. I was taken to the station. I had a good alibi. I was at the radio station presenting my show. But the police took me in for questioning. I sat in a jail cell, not knowing what would happen next. In the end, I realized what the watcher meant with their proposition. They had a game for me, and I played it. And when they meant change my life, well, being in prison is pretty life-changing. In my jail cell, my mind conjures up all sorts of wild theories. I've been wondering what that D stood for on that last cassette tape. I think it might have meant death, but who knows? It's hard to say.